Tuğberk, how are you today?
I'm very good, Trond. How are you?
I am doing well as well. I'm excited to talk about zero user interfaces. You have a master's degree from Tampere University of Technology, and you've been interested, I think, in these technologies for a while. And now you work at Futurice as head of innovation. But tell me a little bit about your path to taking a strong interest in, in how technology shapes up. What was it that created this interest?
Sure. And great to be here and discussing this topic with you. Well, I mean, let me take a step back before talking about my career in Tampere. I did my bachelor degree on electronics engineering, and my graduation thesis was about training facial recognition algorithm. And this was around 2011, so way ahead of facial recognition becoming a sort of commodity, especially in consumer markets. So that is where I kind of gathered some interest and understanding of this kind of technologies like facial recognition, biometrics technologies. How do they work? And what are the caveats? How can you basically utilize them in different contexts? So that was kind of the beginning of my story. And then once I moved to Tampere for doing my master's degree on business and technology management,
Yep.
things started to have a little bit more consumer focus or like application focus rather than engineering and research focus. And the very first interest in creating applications around this kind of technologies actually dates back to 2013, 2014, when a group of students from Tampere, including myself, actually was involved developing the first ever commercial Google Glass application in Finland. So
I love this. I love that it started with a student project. Every time I ask people how they got into something, there's always an interesting background, and I love the fact that it was a student project.
Yeah, I mean that's what Finland is great at. Putting putting the students, with the corporate collaboration, right from the gate during the studies. And this was a specific university, academia, and then corporate collaboration where a software consultancy in Tampere was supporting us, basically creating a Google Glass application for traffic wardens. Those people who make sure that parking tickets are paid or not. And the problem we're solving there was the fact that it's a very lengthy process. I mean, they get into trouble, while at it, because the process is so long. They get into trouble. They catch up find themselves in arguments with the angry drivers, because there's multiple stakeholders in this. There's the city, there's the technology providers, there's the online parking ticket providers, there's the machines that you see out there, and the paper tickets. So you need to make sure that you check all of these. And for each operation, for each task, they almost had a different device. So they had a smartphone to write down your license plate to see if you have paid or not. Then they had this, couple of kgs mini PC in their pocket that they carry around all day long, where they type all the details relating to the car. So what is the license plate? What is the brand? What is the color? What is the address? So all these things they need to basically manually input. And then they have a printer they carry, which basically prints the ticket, and they leave it there. And this process can take up to 5 minutes, basically. So what we have done was basically used computer vision and license plate recognition to take a photo whenever there's a license plate in the field of view of the camera, and automatically check it with the parking ticket providers, online parking ticket providers, and deliver the results to the traffic ward. So basically, if the ticket is not paid for, automatically the system directed the user to actually print the license plate. And all these information that they needed to actually input manually were understood from the image that the glass was taking. So the address came from the GPS, the color of the car, the license plate, the model. These are all included in the image that we attached to the ticket itself. So all of a sudden, you end up with a process of seconds, from minutes to seconds. And when you are involved in that kind of transformation, when you see that happening before your eyes, your brain starts to wire in a different way. You start to seek these kind of, where can I find something similar? This process involvements, radical or even incremental innovation, where we can make the life of these people better. So your brain goes into that mode where like you start to have an eye for these kind of stuff, and that's when basically I remembered this old memory of mine where I did my thesis on facial recognition. And then I was like, okay, if we are able to recognize license plates and make the process much faster, much more convenient for this group of people, where can we use facial recognition to recognize people and make their experience equally convenient and seamless? And of course the place probably everybody thinks um, more like the experiences where we have like stress kind of embedded into it. Of course, airports and a traveling experience came to my mind first, and that's also
Mm.
coming from an old memory where I was a part-time check-in agent at an Istanbul airport back in the day, and being involved in checking people in and hearing their complaints all the time, how stressful and how long this process is. So kind of at that point, like putting the pieces of the puzzle together and actually coming up with a concept where the idea was like, why don't we recognize? Let's start with the premium passengers, so the platinum loyal customers of airlines. Why don't we recognize these group of people, since we airlines do know a lot about them, and they are receptive for this kind of exclusive services. There's a demand for it. So why don't we use the same idea to actually recognize this group of people? And then at the end of my studies, I sent an email to Helsinki Airport. Um, Actually, the group is called Finavia. Helsinki Airport is one airport in Finland that they operate. And that's how I landed my thesis position. So for 10 months, I actually investigated both technical and business feasibility of this kind of concept being applied at the airport. And at the end of the day, we delivered the thesis. The results were promising. And the story goes that uh, at the time, Futurist or Futurize was the digital partner of Helsinki Airport and Finavia, and still is actually. So they basically asked Futurize to hire me so that they could continue on the project. So that's how I started at Futurize back in the year 2016. And my like a first order of business was setting up a biometrics unit to explore more and more of these, human machine interaction technologies and how they're going to shape the future of it.
Huh. This is fascinating because these are two fairly manual sort of frontline tasks that one might not have picked as the most obvious. Not everyone would call these complicated work processes because it's not so visible. I guess in the airport you're frustrated because you're waiting there with your luggage, but I don't think we necessarily all appreciate how complicated and how many tasks are involved in each of these two sort of frontline service jobs or frontline kind of worker positions. So here's my question: Why? And you've obviously started answering in it with these two examples, but why think of a world beyond the screen? What is it that? I mean, I'm sitting in front of three screens right now. I'm, happily. But I will admit I am also slightly frustrated with the screen. Um, so why think beyond the screen? And what is the prospect that we will move beyond the screen? Because it seems to me that we are in this digital age where there may be at least a transition period where it's going to be much more of the screen facing work, right? We are going to be fairly passively doing kind of digitization 1.0. We're going to be in front of these screens. So what do you say to that? And how realistic are beyond these smaller experiments, admittedly that you have done in kind of augmented reality, how far are we from taking large chunks of work into the augmented realm where we don't need these screens anymore?
Yeah, very good question. And actually, the continuation of my individual story partially would answer that. And let's start from there and then expand a little bit. But as soon as I started this biometrics business unit at Futurist, after a couple of cases, like we continued working on Finavia and Finnair on what we call the walk-paced identification. And then we created multiple individual applications here and there, facial recognition payments, facial recognition smart vending machines, using all sorts of other element of computer vision in general. But what we've realized is people are not interested in biometrics per se. I mean, like in any technology, people are interested in the value proposition. What is it in it for me? What part of my life it really enhances in a way? And that's when we actually started to see this pattern where what we are really interested in, or what we are really seeking for, this actually, this is not a new thing, but we are basically, especially in this era, quite wired to choose the path of least resistance. I guess that comes from due to the fact that we're being bombarded with so much information from so many different channels. Technology came to our life to make our lives better, and it did for sure in many ways. But also, it basically brought all these noise that we have all the time around us. So what we realize is people are trying to get away from it, or maybe even shift the responsibility of parsing that information. Shift that responsibility to the service provider or to whatever it is that they're interacting with. And that's when we realize that the paradigm shift we're looking at is not biometrics. It's what we basically call the zero user interfaces. And then the name refers to here is that the fact that you don't need to actually interact with a physical interface like your screen in order to be able to access the information or access the services and products that you need. And this is not something we at Futurice invented. I mean, many companies have observed the same paradigm shift. Some people named it as beyond digital, ambient computing, calm technology, as Google calls it.
Yeah, so I mean the available technologies just in terms of chatbots, right? If you think about Alexa, Google Home, Siri, Cortana, those are, I guess, one instantiation of it, although arguably they haven't they're delivered fully on their promise. I mean, I was one of the beta users of all of these, but I mean, beyond some very pedestrian use cases, like alarms and stuff, and the weather, super useful things. Sometimes the recipe, although that hasn't really panned out so much because you still need the screen to see this thing. What are some of the more interesting kind of gesture-based or other types of interfaces that you think have some promise?
Sure, I'll answer that, but you made a good point in there. So we have the chatbots, we have these voice assistants that try to touch us, that aspect of what we are talking about here. But I guess it's important to define what constitutes a truly zero user interface experience in a way. So it has building blocks, and some of these individual technologies that you mentioned, chatbot or voice recognition, it addresses a part of it, makes that one single building block. But without the complementary parts, it's not going to ever deliver the actual promise of what we're talking about here. So throughout our work, we basically categorized these building blocks under three categories. So the first one is the service or the product actually recognizes whom they are serving to. So there's this recognition of the individual that the system is interacting with. And nowadays, it's still mostly hidden behind passwords and traditional identification systems. So that's where, for example, the biometrics focus comes in. And biometrics is not the, of course, only technology that is able to do that intuitively, of course, but it's one technology within that realm. The second part, the interaction part. And that is where, for example, likes of Alexa, Google Home is heavily utilized. Interacting with a service essentially should be as easy as, grabbing a cup of coffee, as intuitive as taking your dog to walk or chatting with a friend. So that's why we see more and more applications of Alexa and Google Home around us. And the third part is the contextual intelligence. Think of this two things that I say: a grand door, a grand entrance to a palace. Without the palace itself, the entrance doesn't really mean anything. It's just you go in, oh, okay, that was cool, and then you probably get back out. So that the palace is the contextual intelligence. So once we recognize the individual and once we know how to intuitively deliver that information, it comes down to what we deliver and when. And that is the contextual intelligence part, which heavily relies on what kind of data we have, what data we have access to and will have access to, and how do we get insights out of it and turn it into some piece of actionable and needed information for the individual.
Well, that's actually a very useful overview. So the question then is, where are we on each of these in sort of and also larger question than that, Tuğberk, when you think about these things, a very fancy word for this is sort of we got to apply some design thinking to like really figure out what's going on, but truly, how do you even just define which use cases are ripe for this kind of disruption or simplification? Because I guess it's, now you have defined what the components are, but if
Yeah.
you start trying to simplify something where the technology just isn't there yet on either of these three components, then you're in trouble. So you earlier talked about two, pretty simple processes, and I'm sure, if you fast forward several years later, they're not still fully implemented right in airports around the world, either of these steps that you talked about for the check-in. And similarly, there are parking wardens around the world who still, at least they have different elements of what you described, and they're not all kind of one-stop shop to get this thing carried out. So how do you think about when you're thinking about new applications? Are you waiting for the end users to kind of come to you with that, or what is the stepwise process to kind of identify these things?
I mean, if you're ahead of the curve, and in my line of work, I usually am. The way it goes, and this is one of the aspects which I love working at a consultancy. We can actually make hypotheses around technology. So we could actually take one technology and try to figure out, where it lands in terms of applications. And we have that luxury because we don't have a single context. We don't have a single scope. We work with companies in insurance, in navigation, in mobility. So basically, we have the luxury to take any technology and look into it, try to make sense of it, and come up with a concept that we are able to sell or experiment. Of course, that is the starting point, that one of the enablers that we have. But the second part is, to answer your question, is technology maturity is an important aspect. So one of the reasons why, for example, we don't see traffic wardens are not, worldwide equipped with the Google glasses, as the fact that the smart glass technology is not come to a price point and then a robustness where we could reliably produce these applications anywhere, and then people are able to use it. So technology maturity plays another role. And the second part is, if you want to achieve a zero UI experience, especially in the societal and business dynamics that we operated currently, and that is going to change, and we will get to there. You need to look into places where the ownership is not distributed. So this is very important. So an anti-example to this, what we have actually done at the Helsinki airport. So we created this walk-based identification experiment there, right? The idea was that we're testing a future where you, as a passenger, register yourself. Once you buy your check-in, you take a selfie. It is attached to your itinerary, and then you come to the airport. And the checkpoints, you're not being stopped. The recognition is done while you walk from point A to B. And we only stop the people who do not have the access to actually be in there, right? So we reverse the process and take the stress out of your itinerary. But the problem with it is that for that to work at the airport, you need to have the airports on board. You need to have the airlines on board. You need to have duty-free people on board. You need to have banks on board, because that they are the ones who actually provide, the payment systems at the airport. Who else? You need to have the border control on board. You need to have the tax office at the airport on board. So all of these people who make up the single itinerary of an experience. And that is not even enough. Like you basically talk to all the Finnish authorities and get them on board it, but your journey doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. Then you go land somewhere. So we actually need to get the other airport and all these officials on board as well in order to provide you the consistent level of experience that you signed up for.
And
So
then don't forget, you need the individuals involved who are going to receive the service, right? Because
for sure.
biometrics is kind of troublesome that way.
Yeah. I mean, of course, when you start this kind of project, you have to have the basic assumptions that there is going to be a certain amount of people who will be receptive for this kind of services. Like that's the beginning assumption, and you validate it through the topic. But yes, so definitely. So you need to have all these stakeholders on board, and it's just. It's a tall order. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but I would respect the authority who's able to orchestrate that ecosystem and put something out there very rapidly. So that's
what you're illustrating though is that this isn't just about the technology at all, really. It's about orchestrating a number of actors, which I guess brings me to, what are the promising industries where you're starting to see some of this happening, or where you think in the next decade that we'll see it? So, I mean, is it fair to say that, I don't know, let's just say construction industry, manufacturing, these are sort of fairly concrete sort of industries where there, at least historically, are a lot of manual actions taking place. But then you also brought in sort of consulting, and there's many other aspects of consulting where not only could you suggest things, regardless of industry, just because you think you might have a solution to it, but there might be some application in consulting in and of itself, perhaps. And what are some of the industries that you find promising, or do you not really look at it in an industry lens? You have to look at the individual kind of task to be done in more than you're looking at the overall industry.
Of course, I mean this is about like the level of impact you are about to make or you are willing to make. We have done, as I said, like looking at individual players who own from beginning to end several processes. We work with banks to create facial recognition payments, for example, where basically we didn't need to bring on board another stakeholder. Everything is handled by the individual organization that is part of it. We created vending machines that are using computer vision and facial recognition to recognize the objects, to recognize the individual, and basically the interaction is similar to what you have at your own fridge. But then we have done that in the retail space, where we have our partner, our client, have the control over whatever is happening in the physical space. So if the goal is to create these single applications and see basically like what is the future where as a company providing these services you should go, or as the recipient of the service, like the client, what should I do with this? These technologies, these trends that are happening. This might be the first thing to basically determine and actually start taking an action for. So that would be the first question. What is the goal? But of course, the second question is, when you're looking for making a bigger impact, create radical innovations based on these big trends and technologies that are coming into our life, then we are looking at something else. We're not looking just, as you said, it's not just technology question or maturity question. It becomes the dynamics of how businesses work.
Well, see, this is what I was going to get to, because, and I don't want to make fun of this, but I know one of the examples that you gave me earlier was you were working for a Norwegian client actually on a smart fridge, and let's not, it's not a joke with the smart fridge. It could be useful, and it is kind of one of these tropes of early technology visionary thinking, where they were sort of, oh yeah, what if we had a smart fridge that recognized what we put in and out? And I realize you've actually done an experiment with it. I don't want to make fun of it, but I want to use it just to sort of illustrate the fact that here we're talking about making an existing fairly mundane action a slight bit more efficient, but not leaps and bounds. But I think, what's really interesting is when you're using technology for a new and creating a new emergent future where the action you're creating didn't exist before, right? So, I mean, in the case of a traffic warden, or in the case of a check-in agent, or even in the case of you getting some stuff in and out of your fridge, these are fairly mundane things, and I would argue they don't change in any fundamental way by being digitized, even if there is a zero UI. So as much as I would love to have my fridge recognize, my cheese when I put it in and out, and how much milk so that I don't run out of milk, my life wouldn't fundamentally alter. But what are some of the things when you are thinking about this in more of a future context? What are some of the things you think could emerge from this development that are slightly more earth shattering than, mechanizing your fridge?
Yeah. So a very good point, and I think one thing that needs clarification here is that, like, the experimentation with these new technologies and these new ideas is usually have a single thought behind it, which is clarifying the uncertainty. And at the end of the day, a result of an experiment could be that, okay, this didn't create the value that we thought that it would create, and that's a valuable result, which tells the company that, okay, maybe we shouldn't spend more resources into this piece of technology or this piece of trend. Coming back to the second question that you posed, I think that is where, like, the point of changing a single interaction, like with your fridge or like when you do a payment, the efforts in there are usually coming short, because I believe our experiences does not consist of single point of interactions. There's a beginning and there's an end. There's a before and after, so it's continuous, right? So that's why we are struggling to create these earth-shattering radical innovations, because companies are have this focus of looking into the processes and things that they own and they can control, and that's where we get stuck at. I'm sure you've heard the famous quote for Buzz Aldrin, which is that I've been promised Mars, but all I have is now Facebook. Not saying that Facebook wasn't an important innovation, but the point being is that this kind of mindset of looking into the your own influence sphere is one of the barriers to create these earth-shattering applications that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that is very true, actually, because if you look at any current company, any current authority, even government, and by the way, government, could really benefit from making their interactions with their citizens slightly less onerous, right? So there's a massive potential here in digital government. But even for government, that really is for many people, important in so many aspects of our lives. It really is about creating a new context where you start collaborating in new ways because the technology makes new things possible. So yeah, I guess coming up with these new applications is it just gonna take experimentation then, and time, and is it a question of just innovation, layering innovation upon innovation, or is there something fundamental here that you personally are waiting for? I mean, is it the cost level of Google Glass, for instance? Obviously, it had a failed launch in the enterprise market. And I mean, in the consumer market, it was a completely overblown idea that this interface was going to sort of take off in the consumer market. Yet, it has made some inroads, in enterprise. Are you working on hoping that these other type of more immersive interfaces are going to drop in price? Like, what is the technology barrier here?
Um, I think, like, working a lot with different pieces of technology, what I have come to realize that it's not at all a technology question. I mean, of course, I mean, Google Glass was a bit early, ahead of time, and still the smart glass is, like, there is going to be attempts, and there is already, like, kind of audio first glasses attempts at the market, but it's still getting there to be part of the consumer market. So for some technologies, things are going to take more time than others. But I think the question is, how do we encourage companies? How do we set structures? How do we set, like, rule of the game so that companies are more open to collaborate and think systemically instead of looking at singular processes that they're owning? And especially in Finland, we see that this slowly start to happen in the industries that are usually physical first. So I'm putting the digital first companies, big platforms aside for a second for this argument's sake. And the reason for that, these companies, like let's take Finland, for example, as an example here that we talk about. Finland has 100-year-old industrial history. I mean, still 80% of the exports are manufacturing of physical goods. This means that we have a lot of companies here who have locked in procedures, heavy investment on physical assets that knows how to that has been optimized to the T to manufacture a single thing precisely. So for these companies to basically start thinking about the new technologies and applications of it, and then how can bring that new business layer on top, they need to hire skills, they need to fund R&D, they need to make investment in developing new services and product, like that digital expertise. And it isn't like from business point of view, from companies who are like listed in the stock market, who lives and dies every quarter. This is an impossible investment to make. And those
But
are the
it's not
companies.
just digital, though. Like you pointed out, it's not just digital expertise. As in, like if you hired a few smart grad students in technology, you wouldn't get to where you want to get. Right? It's really about creativity, and it's about combining some relationship to what you were doing in the past in your manufacturing firm with some really radical opportunities to perhaps do completely different things,
Yeah,
right? Because this is what you're talking about. When this really is implemented, it could mean that you go from, I mean, famously, right, Nokia, they were manufacturing shoes and rain boots, basically, right? And then they went to cell phones, right? I mean, it is actually akin to the Nokia move, right? The kinds of leaps and bounds it is, going from rain boots to cell phones is not very obvious. And I think what you're talking about is even more radical, because it's maybe doesn't even involve manufacturing anymore, right? It could be that the expertise that the company had is best applied in a completely different domain.
for sure. I mean, a good example for this is like the early signs of this happening here is the construction industry. I mean, it's a zero sum game. It has been a zero sum game, construction industry, for a good while, because it's basically either you win that particular construction project or the other. So it's like a competition that doesn't generate new markets, new overall value, but just compete for the resources. So what is happening here is that they started to actually stop thinking construction as a thing that a construction company builds, and then the subconstructor comes put the elevator, and then the other company brings in the sensor. They started to look at the whole picture. What is the whole value chain that we're delivering here? And we have a government supported ecosystem here, is called Keiko, Keko. That's how you spell it. And they are basically looking at the 7 big companies who are operating in building ecosystem. These are people flow companies, these are sensor companies, these are construction companies, these are technology providers, IT companies. They put together their resources, data assets, APIs together to see the big picture, like what other value that we can provide, what living experiences by putting together other data sources and assets together, what kind of new living experiences that we can create that doesn't exist yet. And this is for any single company in this ecosystem to do this. It is, as I say, it comes back to what I told you as an example of a manufacturing company, hiring all that talent, spotting all these opportunities and building every single block that leads to that value proposition. It's just a massive investment, and it hasn't been done. It's not going to be done. So that's why now companies looking at where can we create these ecosystem thinking, where the output of the ecosystem is much bigger than any of the individual stakeholders of that ecosystem can actually create.
So this brings me to the question. A lot of what you're describing is, as exciting as it is slightly sort of nebulous concepts. What are the lighthouses that we should be looking at in terms of seeing this come to life? Are there startups that we should be looking at? Are there technology companies? I mean, obviously, tracking Google Glass and other AR technology. Are there corporations that are starting, individual corporations where we can where you foresee that this kind of thinking will emerge first and we should look there? Where should people who are interested in this, who want to track these opportunities, these trends, or I mean, this is not even really a trend yet, right? It is, you know, these immersive things are kind of happening almost like mushrooming, a little bit under the radar, actually. Where should people look?
Um, well, I mean, I think I would maybe like there are certain areas to look into, and they play different roles in this market, and how like they should be looked at in terms of what is it that they bring or they take away from it. And the first one is the drivers. So the drivers are like the context or the applications that is actually driving the development of these kind of technologies. And those are the industries that I see that are heavily driving those is the autonomous driving and the smart home industry. So with especially autonomous driving, the meaning of being in the car is changing, right? It's moving away from doing like driving actively, paying attention to something, to doing something useful with your time in the car. And that's why I see that companies already heavily investing in sensors and edge computing technologies in order to sense what is happening in the car and react to it proactively, provide the services and information that the individual needs at the time of the need. And that is bringing a lot of investment into the startups who are actually operating in this domain. A good example is, again, from Finland. There is this sensor company called ForceIoT or Force IoT. It's based in Tampere, and then they are manufacturing this paper thin, stretchable printed sensors. So basically, what they are effectively doing is providing the means to turn every single physical surface into a digital experience. And the automotive industry, not so surprisingly, is one of the biggest buyers, where we see these technologies coming into the console of the car to understand, how the interaction in the car works and how can we react to it. So those companies are the drivers. Hence, they're also driving where the investment goes in terms of what technology develops. Of course, there's going to be some companies affected adversely, or industries going to be affected adversely from this development, which is one concrete example that comes to my mind is the healthcare. So when we have so much sensing technologies around us that are doing continuous sensing, uh, and it's mobile, the point of care type of healthcare approach is going to be in one way or another disrupted. I mean, we're already looking at, for example, take brain computer interfaces, which you have used for medical purposes at controlled environment in clinics in hospital to sense certain brain signals like EEG, for example. We started to see commercial application, end user applications of it. It's measuring your sleep, measuring your stress level, measuring how your meditation goes. So these devices are measuring constantly like vital health data. And already we are seeing some signs of from industry, how to healthcare industry, how to actually incorporate this data that is uncontrolled. It's not from a controlled environment. How can we get that data and make use out of it? Is it in research? Can it be used, for example, before you go to the hospital? Without you coming to the hospital, we can judge if you're ready for surgery or not. We don't need to book you a slot. We just follow you at your home with your device for 5 days, and if you see that it's not working well for you, we automatically postpone the things and save a lot of money while doing so. So obviously, the healthcare is one of the industries that I believe going to be affected by this, as the kind of like on the disrupted stakeholder end, if we don't react rapidly.
All right. Well, on that note, these are interesting prospects, Tuğberk. I think we have covered a lot of ground. It seems like this area is going to evolve perhaps rapidly, but it's going to also unfold slightly surprisingly and with kind of ebbs and flows. It doesn't seem like we're not waiting for one thing here. We're kind of looking at an emergent phenomenon, and like you pointed out, these ecosystems will have to evolve. And they're going to create interesting winners and losers. I thank you so much for laying this out for us, and best of luck in your continuous innovation efforts.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.